welcome to this session on Saturday, the 9th of January. My name's Lucy Ford. I'm a lecturer in international relations at Oxford Brookes, and I'm chairing this session, or moderating this session for Rob Hopkins, who's going to tell us a little bit about his latest book, From What Is to What If. And he's going to tell us how we need to cultivate our imagination alongside agricultural produce. So for those of you who haven't heard of Rob before, given that we have a global audience here with people from all over the world, but you may of course have heard of him. He is the co-founder of the Transition Town Totnes and Transition. Welcome to this session on Saturday, the 9th of January. My name is Lucy Ford. I'm a lecturer in international relations at Oxford Brookes.
Lucy?
Yes?
You need to close the tab with Crowdcast.
I have to close what? Sorry?
Crowdcast. You have Crowdcast open in another tab. So make sure that's closed. Oh, not at all.
I'm so sorry.
Not at all. Okay, continue.
So, sorry about that, everybody. Anyway, Rob is the founder of the Transition Town Totnes and Transition Network. He's written many books, including the Transition Handbook, the Transition Companion. He's won awards, he's got PhDs, and he runs a brewery. And you can read about all of that on his website. I'm going to hand over the floor to Rob, who's going to inspire us to have more imagination for the future. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. So lovely to be here. I long desired to come to the Oxford Real Farming Conference, and although this isn't in person and we can't all go for a drink afterwards, it's a delight to be here. And I want to start by asking you to do something. This is not going to be entirely keynote style. I want to ask you to do something first, which is you have a chat box where you are, where you can put in ideas and reflections. I'm going to show you an object, and I'm going to give you 1.5 minutes to think of as many alternative uses for that object as possible. They don't need to be sensible. They don't need to be something that you could get patented tomorrow morning. Just really write down as many as you can think of, from the conventional to the completely absurd. We'll just spend 1.5 minutes of you just writing ideas down into the chat box of what this object could be used for. Okay, so your object is a construction helmet, and you have 1.5 minutes starting now. So we've got some coming in already. So it could be a soup bowl or a hammer or a watering can. I'm just going to turn my... They're coming to me by WhatsApp, you see. Just going to do my sound so you don't have to listen to that all the time. Okay. A sledge, a baby seat, maybe. A bird bath, very good. A plant pot. We get a lot of plants growing in here. A robot casing. Oh, okay, very good, very good. Mold for casing. A hanging basket. Oh, that could be quite nice. Very good. A mold for concrete. For painting, or to paint it because it's white. Fantastic. A hat of confidence. I think we could all use one of those, particularly in these days at the moment. A jelly mold. I like that. An egg incubator. You can always tell when you're at a farming conference, can't you? A throw-up bucket. Well, hopefully you're not going to need that before the end of this hour. An oven. Very good. A hedgehog nest. Fantastic. A goblet. Very good. Well, thank you all so much for doing that. And I know there's a 20-second lag, so there will be some coming in that I won't be able to see. But the reason that I like to start with that object, and someone just said a moon rocket, which I think I need to go away and think about for a little while. But that's what an active imagination can do. It can turn this into a moon rocket, which is kind of what we're here to talk about today, which is to talk about imagination. I just spent the last couple of years writing and then publishing a book about imagination and why imagination is so important in 2021 with the challenges that we have ahead of us. I wanted to just start by sharing this little story, which is, so this is in 2006, the very first activity we did for Transition Town Totnes down here in my town in the southwest of England. We planted some walnut trees. We bought them from Martin Crawford's Agroforestry Research Trust, hybrid walnuts that can produce as much protein and carbohydrates a hectare as organically grown wheat. And we thought, well, we should just be planting these everywhere. We should be planting them in the town, in the parks, in gardens, in corners. And so this was the first tree that we planted. And we could have just planted a tree and said, there we go, we've done that. But actually what we did was we announced to the world that we had declared Totnes to be the nut tree capital of Britain. We kind of built a story around this. And actually already now by 2021, we've planted more than 400 nut-bearing trees in and around the town. But I loved that idea of saying, no, this is about the story. We want to use this to fire people's imagination. So they might be saying, do you know what they're doing in Totnes? They've just declared themselves the nut tree capital of Britain. I think people had assumed that we were the nut capital for a little while, but we're the nut tree capital of Britain. And so far, no one else has challenged us for this title. And we managed to get our mayor at the time to pose here with walnuts on the end of a spade. So these kind of stories, how do we storytell better about what we do? The human imagination is an extraordinary thing. And we're all here because we want to see a revolution in terms of food and farming. And you can't build what you can't imagine. We have to be able to imagine it first. We have to rebuild and reimagine simultaneously. My favorite definition of the human imagination is that it is the ability to see things as if they could be otherwise. If there ever was a time in our history when our survival depended on our ability to see things as if they could be otherwise, this is that time. And I always like to start when I give talks with a little bit of maybe what Extinction Rebellion would call tell the truth. Which is to say, we are currently standing on top of this mountain, and beneath our feet is more inequality, more plastic, more debt, more loneliness, more carbon than humanity has ever stood on top of before. And for some people, on the top of this mountain, the views are fantastic, certainly not for everybody. And the guides at our side who know this mountain really well are telling us, we need to get down off this mountain really quickly. Can you see the storm clouds that are coming? And for some people, that works. That's enough. But I wonder if actually, if this was going to be a revolution that was going to be driven by facts and figures and policy arguments, it would have been started in the 1980s, and it would have been so much easier. We've left it so late. I feel like actually one of the key things we need to be doing is to be telling the stories of the lower slopes of this mountain, of the valleys that await us down there, of the warm welcome, the food, the drink, the dry socks, and the firesides that await us once we get there. And then this becomes the work, not of facts and figures, it becomes the work of longing and the cultivation of longing and imagination. And so what I really want to be looking at in this presentation is about how do we cultivate longing for a low carbon future in such a way that it becomes the thing that everybody gets out of bed in the morning to make happen. Longing is fundamental to this, I think. Ursula Le Guin, one of the great guardians of imagination in our culture, put it beautifully. She said, the exercise of imagination is dangerous to those who profit from the way things are, because it has the power to show that the way things are is not permanent, not universal. We will not be free if we do not imagine freedom. And I feel like we are at a time in 2021 where our imagination, our collective imagination, is in serious danger. There was a research published in 2010 by a woman called Kyung-hee Kim, researcher in the US, where she argued that imagination and IQ had risen together until the mid-90s, at which point IQ had continued to rise and imagination had gone into what she called a steady and persistent decline, and has been declining ever since. She blamed that on the decline of play in our culture. She blamed it on the lack of the decline in the amount of time we spend outside, the rise of testing in schools, and the amount of time we spend on screens. And I think we can add to that the kind of pre-traumatic stress disorder that people experience from climate change. Many different factors are converging together, and I'll touch more on that in a minute. But if we're at a time when the imagination is shrinking, at the very time when we need to be able to reimagine everything, then we have a really serious challenge. And I wonder whether, instead of focusing on what's breaking down and on the problems, and absolutely we need to be doing that, but I wonder at the same time whether we need to become so much better at talking about what it would be like to live in a world where all of this had happened. How do we bring alive for people how that future would be? The poet Rilke once said, "The future must enter into you a long time before it happens," which is so beautiful that I'm going to say it twice. The future must enter into you a long time before it happens. This is the work of James Mackay, who works at the University of Leeds. He's a kind of a graphic artist who brings scientific ideas alive through his work. This is his drawing of what our cities might look like if they were designed to be the most biodiverse they could possibly be. We could do this in 10 years. We could put in place all of the conditions, but the thing that's missing is the longing. What would it smell like? What would it sound like? What would it taste like to live in a city where that had already happened? This is his drawing of once we really start to accelerate taking cars out of the center of our cities, what might we use that space for? Maybe our kids, rather than walking to school past polluted traffic jams, can walk to school through streets with food being grown. This is all entirely possible and could happen within a short period of time if we can cultivate the longing for it first, which is the work of imagination and is the work of storytelling. And one of the ways that I love to do this is I run a podcast called From What If to What Next. And in every episode, I ask my two guests to close their eyes and imagine they travel forward to 2030. And whatever the what if question we're exploring that day, to tell us what's it like there now that this thing has become a reality. And I just want to share with you, Josh is just in a moment going to play a little 1 minute section. I just took out some little clips of some people talking about food. What would the world in relation to food be like in 2030? And I think hearing people talking like this impacts our imagination in a different way. And maybe when you listen to it, you might allow the future to enter into you a long time before it happens. Josh?
Have time to grow their food in their backyards and to share it with neighbors and take time to chat to neighbors. They won't have to buy so much package-laden, pre-made goods that they just bang in the microwave.
People are healthier. You can see it. People spend time gardening or cooking or with their family, doing things that really matter to them.
Lots of fruits and vegetables and herbs growing.
A huge amount of garden farming happening in the private spaces, but also community gardens and urban agriculture, commercial enterprises.
Micro-entrepreneurialism is rife.
The goal really is that all of the city's children, whatever their social condition, can have access to quality food.
And you could smell that as well, thyme and lavender. Can smell ripening fruit, the cherry tree, and it's just this vibrant explosion of colors and smell and of people.
So I guess the question I would is, how might you, in the work that you do around food and farming and a new vision of how food and farming could be, how can you help the future to enter into people? We see this already starting to happen. I love what's happening in Barcelona now, where they're taking a third of the streets in the center of the city away from cars and turning them into forests and places for play and conviviality. This is possible when the longing is created for it to happen. So a question: what do Dr. Seuss and Edward Lear and Jay-Z have in common? And the answer is that they all are people who flourished because of limits, using things like rap or haikus that limit what we're able to do, actually increase our imagination. Limits allow the imagination to expand. As Leonardo da Vinci once put it, art lives from constraints and dies from freedom. Green Eggs and Ham came about when Dr. Seuss was challenged by his publisher to write a book containing just 50 words. And what I see again and again is that when we impose the limits that these times put upon us, climate emergency, social justice, the ecological emergency, and all of these things, actually then we see so much more imagination. This in the middle in the green jumper is Julie Brown, who is going to be speaking at this conference at 6 p.m. on the 13th. This is a project that she was one of the people who started in Hackney in London called Growing Communities. Fantastic urban food project. They do veg boxes and farmers markets. They grow food in the city in an increasing number of small intensive market gardens in the city. One of the things Julie created, which I just love, is this model of what would it look like? To what extent could London feed itself? And as she says, that different parts could produce a certain amount of food. You could grow some food in urban back gardens, in connecting with the peri-urban land around the city, the rural hinterland, and so on. What I love about this is it takes the limits that we have put upon us in terms of the massive need to reduce carbon emissions by about 10% a year, starting right now, and turns that into a phenomenal opportunity. This creates a template in the same way that donut economics does, in which our imagination can absolutely run riot in a way which in business as usual economics, it doesn't. Limits offer such an opportunity for the imagination to flourish, and it's something that I've seen again and again in the transition movement. For example, this is Transition Kensal to Kilburn in London, who planted a food garden on their underground train station. This is the Edible Bus Stop project in London, where along one whole bus route, communities have made food gardens, many of those bus stops. So in theory, you could get on the bus at the first one, jump out at everyone, pick something, and by the time you get home, you've got a salad. The driver might not be too happy, but this is the kind of imagination that can flourish when we recognize the opportunities that these times present. One of the things is important in that is the idea of space. Imagination needs space. We need to create in our movements and our projects the space that imagination needs, which is all too often lost when we're just too busy focusing on tasks. We need to re-examine the idea of a universal basic income as being a national imagination strategy. Places also have a really important role to play. This is Waterloo Bridge, when Extinction Rebellion occupied it last year, and they turned it for 2 weeks into a forest. And for 2 weeks, people got to experience living as if that bridge was a forest. People would stop, and who walked across it every day would stop and say, why can't it always be like this? And the power that places have to change our sense of what's possible, so that when we go back to where we came from, we see it through very, very different eyes. This is a transition group in Brussels, in Mille Bruxelles, which is the red light district in Brussels. Many of the people who live on this street are involved in transition. Their local municipality wanted to close the street to stop men driving up and down it all night, and they put 2 blocks of concrete, you can just see there in the picture. And the people on the street said, could we make a garden? The municipality said, well, we'll pay for the materials if you make the garden. And they made this garden. Now, this garden is not going to feed this street. It's not going to feed one family on the street. Every family who wants one gets a bed about 1 meter by 1 meter. But what this garden did was it gave people such a powerful sense that they could change things if they wanted to. It became it went from being a street where nobody would stop, where nobody would really hang around, to a place where if someone was gardening, people would come and join them, children would come and play. It started to change the whole story that place told about itself. And there were many projects that then came from this and from the people who lived on the street that were really ambitious. But when I asked them, how did you decide you could do that? They all said, because of that garden. It changed our story. It changed our imagining of what we thought we could do. And big urban agriculture projects. I love Princess Innengarten in Berlin, one of the biggest tourist attractions in Berlin. It's a place that you go to, and afterwards, when you go home to where you came from, everything looks kind of different. Its possibilities have changed. It's your sense of what might be possible there has profoundly changed, and I think we need to be really connecting up our stories in that way. In London, transition town Crystal Palace started a food market, Crystal Palace Food Market, which then went on to win many awards in London for Best Farmers Market, has created a space for many people to start new livelihoods, new businesses. One of the things I loved about it was that they created something called the Patchwork Farm, where over their work as a transition group over the years before, they had supported and created so many places where food was being grown through Crystal Palace that they were able to join them up and see them as being a farm. And there was one stall at the market where someone would go out every morning, pick something from each of those gardens, present it on the stall there. And I love that idea that we start to look at our towns and our cities patchwork farms in that sense. We have to recognize, though, when we talk about the imagination, that we don't all start from the same place. Imagination, to a degree, is a function of privilege. That if your basic needs for food and shelter and safety aren't being met, it's very, very hard to live an imaginative life. And this is a part of the brain called the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is the place where your imagination and your memory fire from. But it's also the part of your brain that is particularly vulnerable to cortisol, anxiety, stress, trauma. And when that happens, it can shrink by up to 20%. And when it shrinks like that, we lose the ability to think about the future in hopeful and positive ways. And we just kind of get stuck in the present and stuck in the past. So when I was researching a book, I wanted to try and find someone or a place that was trying to expand the hippocampus, a place where they were trying to create, if you like, a kind of a campus for the hippocampus. And I went to Dundee, this amazing project called Art Angel, run by Rosalie Somerton here, where they work with people with mental health problems, with burnout, with stress, trauma. They say, when you come here, you're not a patient, you're not a client, you're an artist who is preparing work for an exhibition. Every year they put on an exhibition in the big gallery in Dundee. And I spoke to so many people there, it was really moving, who had all kinds of terrible stories about what had led them to be there. And one woman who told me that she had spent the last 4 years in her pajamas. 6 months ago, she had come that close to killing herself, even though she had 2 beautiful small children. And she said, since I've been coming here, I can see the future again. You know, you could see the hippocampi of all of these people stretching and expanding. And one of the things that they do there, I said to them, why does this work? She said, because what we create here is a place of safety and hope. And we have to, I think, recognize that the capacity to live an imaginative life is not evenly distributed. Inequality is ruinous to the imagination. Austerity should be seen as a direct assault on the imagination. We have an education system that makes virtually no space for the imagination whatsoever. And we wonder why we are seeing many of the problems that we see in the world. And they, at Art Angel, every year, to continue their funding, they ask their artists to fill out a piece of paper that has 2 outlines of a human form on. And they say, fill the first one to show how you felt before you came here, the second to show how you feel now you've been coming here for a while. And I looked through a big pile of these, and it was very moving. And I just want to share one with you that I think really needs very little explanation. So when I look at that, firstly, you see the power of the work that they do. But when I look at that, that for me is the picture that I hold in my mind when I think about the transformation that food and farming can take over the next 10 or 15 years, needs to take over the next 10 or 15 years. The next 10 or 15 years, if we do everything we can possibly do, we'll feel like it has been a revolution of the imagination. It'll be an extraordinary time to have lived through. And I look at this picture, and that's kind of one of the things that really gets me out of bed every morning, is that sense that actually this could be so extraordinary if we get it right. But we have to be able to imagine it first and allow ourselves to believe that it might be possible. One of the things in the transition movement that we've done is these things called local economic blueprints, of trying to make the economic case at a very local scale for a more local, more resilient approach to food production. And one of the parts of that was we did these mapping work with an amazing organization called GeoFutures in Bath, where we tried to explore this question of, could this place feed itself? Mapping the land and mapping the degree of food security that was possible, and how that then overlapped with different settlements that were around us. And the conclusion was kind of maybe sort of, but we need to have a very, very different diet. But again, it was a question about asking a question within limits and setting those limits. And they did the same thing in Norwich. Transition Norwich did a Can Norwich feed itself study, and there were various things that then came out of it as practical projects that they went and created. For example, they started Farm Share as a community supported agriculture scheme that now has hundreds of members and is a really beautiful example of that. And one of the things that also came out of it was Hodmedods, who many of you will know of, the fantastic company who are rediscovering and re-pioneering UK grown grains and pulses in a way that has just transformed, I think, people's sense of what might be possible. But again, when you put the limits in place and you create the conditions for people to come together and ask what if and explore things through fresh eyes in a way that is not about the difference between yes but and yes and. I think so many of us get used to coming forward with great ideas and being met with yes but. Yeah, but it's too late, or yes but it's too expensive, or whatever. Actually, the difference between that and yes and is enormous. And when you study improv, and I did some improv training when I was researching the book, in improv you do yes and, where someone makes a suggestion and someone else says yes, and you know, we could go to Paris, yes, and we could go up the Eiffel Tower, yes, and we could fly off the top, and we could, yes, and creating a culture within our organizations and movements of yes and is so brilliant, because you start to see the things like Hodmedods that emerge from that kind of a community yes and imagination process. And this is a beautiful exercise that was developed in the transition movement and with an organization called Encounters Arts that we call Transition Town Anywhere or Pop Up Tomorrow. You need a big space. This is in Battersea Arts Centre the last time we did it. And you need between 100 and 400 people. And you start off by imagining that you step into 2030, a bit like in the sound file I played you at the beginning. And imagining that actually everything that could have happened has happened. It's not utopia, but it's the result of everything that could have happened being done. And you meet other people who share the things that you're interested in about that future. And then together you then build it. You create it in physical form with cardboard and string and sticky tape and pens, and then you live in it and you trade in it, and it's a phenomenal thing. As I said before, the future must enter into you a long time before it happens. You play the future, and it's such a different experience than intellectually thinking about the future. You bring it to life with play. These two young men here who were part of it last time we did it, this might look to you like some chairs and some cardboard boxes. As far as they're concerned, they have built the public transport system for Transition Town Anywhere. They can tell you everything about this, the color of the tickets, what it's made of, what it sounds like, what it runs on. Everything about it for them is a complete reality. And it's a very powerful thing to do. This is the first time we did that exercise was in 2012, and that's me in 2012. I ended up with a group of people where we dreamed something called the Yeast Collective. It was a brewery and a bakery and a mill in the same building. And we thought, well, of course 2030 is going to have that. That's so fantastic. Why would that not be everywhere? So we imagined how it would work, how our community investment project worked, what our beers were called, what our training program was. The following year in my town, I was part of a group who started a brewery called the New Lion Brewery. And last year, we transformed the New Lion Brewery into being one of the UK's first 100% community-owned breweries. We raised £180,000. We now have 270 owners, and we raised that money explicitly to move our brewery into the same building as a mill and a bakery. And when people would say to me, but Rob, how do you know that's going to work? That sounds like a crazy idea. I would say, I know it will work because I played it. I absolutely know it will work because I played it. So how do we find those opportunities for people to play a different kind of future? And I just want to wrap up with a couple of stories of things that I've seen where, for me, one of the great practices that we need to cultivate is the ability to ask a really great what-if question. A good what-if question opens up a sense of possibility. It kind of invites us to think about the future in a different way. This is from a town who anybody who is French listening to this will curse my pronunciation because I always say it wrong. I think it's called Montsartou. It's about half an hour inland from Nice. And a few years ago, the French government said 20% of all food served in schools should be organic. And in Montsartou, they said, well, if 20% is better for the children than 0%, why are we stopping at 20%? What if we just went straight to 100%? And what if we used that as the opportunity to reimagine the economy and the biodiversity and the opportunities of this place? So the municipality bought some land that was about to be developed for luxury housing, and they turned it into a market garden. They grow the biggest chard I've ever seen in my life, and they produce 70% of all the food for all the schools there. And what they found, which was so fascinating, was a whole shift of behavior change in families at the school, in parents at the school. 60% of families who before had never bought organic food started to buy organic food. It led to a whole shift. Kids were learning to cook. It's a really phenomenal story, but it started because they got the what if question right. And what they have created is one of those things that I just love and I look for everywhere, those solutions to climate change that are win-win, win-win, win-win-win solutions. They're good for mental health, physical health, local economy, biodiversity, etc., etc., etc. That's what we can do when we really bring imaginative ideas into this and give up on the idea of business as usual, give up the idea of small incremental steps. As Naomi Klein said, there are no non-radical solutions left. And one of my favorite projects that has come out of the transition movement comes from Liège in Belgium. And about 5-6 years ago, I went to Liège, and the transition group there had come up with a what if question. They said, what if in a generation's time, the majority of food eaten in this city came from the land closest to this city? What a beautiful question. They invited everybody who cared about food and farming and academics and farmers and baristas and everybody to a big event, series of events. And then, which I went to the first one of. And then I went home and I didn't hear very much for a few years. 2 years ago, I went back to Liège. And in that time in Liège, they have created 25 cooperatives, and they've raised 5 million euros of investment from local people, not from banks, from local people moving their money into these cooperatives. They started a cooperative vineyard, which raised 2.5 million euros. And I remember saying to the guy who did it, what made you think you could raise 2.5 million euros? And he looked at me a little bit. He said, it's Belgium. People like wine. Some people have some money. Don't be afraid. And so that was really the logic that we used when we did the crowdfunder for our brewery. You know, it's Totnes. People like beer. Don't be afraid. So they started this shop called the Small Producers in the center of the city. After 6 months, it was doing so well, they opened a second. They now have 4 of these shops. I met the mayor of Liège, who said to me, we used to say we wanted to be a smart city. Now we want to be a transition city. This is now the story of our city. This is Pascal, who manages the Petit Producteur, the small producer shops. And I said to him, what's the potential of this? And he said, I think by the time we have 12 of these shops, the supermarkets will start to fragilize. Beautiful word, fragiliser in French, which we don't really have in English, but it works so well. You know, do we need to campaign against the overthrow of supermarkets, or do we build something better and more desirable and invite people to step off onto that? They have a project called Crea Farm, working with the municipality, who have mapped all of the land around the city, tested it for contamination, identified its aspect and its soil types, and they offer it through Ceinture Alimentaire to young people who want to start new food-based businesses, and they call it Farm. They started a community brewery, which I had to go and visit. You know, we all have to do our bit for the revolution. But actually, what you see in Liège is a place reimagining itself. And when I had the conversation with Christian Jaunet, who's one of the main organizers of it, and asked him why they were able to raise 5 million euros of investment from local people, he said, because we had a story. We had the story. It was about the narrative, and people wanted to be part of the narrative because the story had sparked their imagination. It had created that longing. It had changed their sense of what might be possible going into the future and what their city would be like. The last thought I want to leave you with before we have a little bit of time for some questions, and just to say that after this, I'm going to be doing a workshop called How to Build a Time Machine, which is going to be some more exercises about this. But I would also say that Dee and Josina, who are doing the workshop after me, are probably far more worth listening to. The work that they do is absolutely fantastic, really builds off what I've been talking about as well. So this is just a last thought to leave you with. This is in Bologna, in Italy, where the municipality noticed that democracy was declining, people were less involved in things. There was so much administration and bureaucracy if people wanted to change anything. And they created something called a civic imagination office, which I just love. Not a civic participation office, a civic engagement office, a civic imagination office. And the civic imagination office, there are 6 of them around the city, and they run big visioning exercises like this, using open space and future imagining exercises. The really brilliant bit is that when the community come up with a great idea, the municipality will say, that's a great idea. Okay, how do we make that happen? And they create a pact. And there's something at the moment in 2021 where, on the rare occasions when our imaginations are invited, they then tend to get ignored, as anyone who knows who's ever gone along to a consultation for a new housing development will know that you put your great ideas on post-it notes, and then you go home and they throw them in the bin and do what they were going to do anyway. So meeting the imagination in the middle, when our imaginations have become so timid, so nervous, so kind of constrained, that idea that you meet the imagination is so important. In Bologna, the municipality in the last 5 years have made 500 pacts with local people, ranging from small things to much, much bigger things. So how, in the organizations that all of us work in food and farming and different things that we're involved in, can we reach out and create pacts and invite people to be imaginative and then meet them in the middle, and then create the capacity and the context within which the imagination can flourish. So I'm going to draw to a close, and just to say, if you want to find out anything else about what I do, robhopkins.net is the blog I do. If you want to find out more about the transition movement, transitionnetwork.org. The podcast that I do that you heard a little clip from before is there and is really good fun. And I just want to finish off with a quote from Neil Gaiman, the author, who said, "We all, adults and children, have an obligation to daydream. We have an obligation to imagine. It's easy to pretend that nobody can change anything, that we are in a world in which society is huge and the individual is less than nothing, an atom in a wall, a grain of rice in a rice field. But the truth is, individuals change their world over and over. Individuals make the future, and they do it by imagining things can be different." Thank you very much for your attention this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Rob, for that really inspiring talk. And I was just reminded of another quote by Rilke. I think he said, "The imagination creates the event," didn't he?
Did he? I like that. I'm going to write that down.
Fun, isn't it? We've got lots of questions from people, and I've sort of made a note of some of them. There's a couple of people who would love to know the name of that artist who was imagined in Leeds. Could you repeat that name?
I can do better than that. I can write it into the chat. Oh, that's the private chat. No, okay. So
if you write it into the chat, Peter can put it into the other chat.
James Mackay.
Wonderful. Also, someone about the author of a study that you mentioned about the loss of imagination.
I will write that in as well. Yeah, Kyung Hee Kim. It's called The Creativity Crisis, and you can find it.
Creativity Crisis. So there's quite a few.
And also there is there's, if anyone's interested as well, at robhopkins.net. So when I was researching the book, all of the interviews that I did as I was going along, I posted on the website. So there is an interview with her, more detail about her work and her thinking.
Wonderful, thank you so much. So lots of questions, and one was about how do we, that education is so important in all of this, and how do we get our governments to transform our educational system to allow more space for imagination?
Oh God, I wish I knew. So there was a whole chapter in the book about that, and I've written several books where which have a section about climate change, and so I have to go off and read the latest climate science, and that is always heartbreaking. I always say to people, if you don't feel deeply worried about the climate emergency, you're not paying attention. Go back and read it again. And actually, the research that I did about the state of health of imagination in our education system in 2020 was equally distressing. Actually, when we have kids taking days off school from stress at the age of 4 in this country. And one of the things that I found most fascinating was I spoke to lots of people doing really interesting experiments all around the world around making education more imaginative. Most of them talked about a particular school or a particular system of schooling that involved in the town of Reggio Emilia in Italy at the end of the war, 1945. They had nothing left. The Germans were retreating north. They left behind a tank, 3 trucks and 6 horses. They sold them to the school based on the fundamental idea of creating a system of education that would ensure that fascism never happens again. And it meant that they didn't teach by subject, they taught by project. At the heart of the school was a workshop. You could go there any time of day. Someone would help you make whatever it is that you want to be able to make. They say the school itself is the third teacher, beautiful, lots of light and plants and stuff. And it always strikes me that actually, particularly this week with everything that we've seen happening in America, that in the UK and in the US and many other places, we have in effect created the complete opposite of what they created in Reggio Emilia. And so in many ways, what we're seeing shouldn't really come as that much of a surprise. People have been warning about the decline of imagination since the 80s, particularly in education. And we lost Sir Ken Robinson this year, who was one of the great people who really spoke out for the role of imagination. I feel like it's really difficult because there are so many people who recognize this as a problem and who are saying, so I need to take my kids somewhere else because the state system isn't providing it. If you go to private schools, they have amazing theater places and art rooms, and they teach creative thinking. If you go to the state sector, that stuff has been almost completely designed out. STEM is just murdering imagination up and down the land, and under the current administration, I can't see anything changing, but we so need the recognition of an imagination crisis in this country and in many, many places. If your imagination, the muscle which should be like this, is actually atrophied, you're in real trouble. I wore this, which is a quote out of the book. Somebody made me this, which imagination is not a luxury, which I rather like. And I feel that should really be the cornerstone of educational policy.
Thanks so much. So a couple of questions around power and difference and diversity, and how do we, let me read it out. How many visions of a better food system or a better world are helpful? Does it matter if our visions are all different? And how do we, or do we need one powerful, hopeful vision to buy into? So kind of like, how do we deal with lots of different visions and lots of different people and lots of different groups having different visions?
Well, there's an exercise that I do when I do talks. Remember, in those far off, heady, distant days when you could actually do a talk to a room full of people, there was an exercise that I would do with those where, which is actually I'm going to do on the workshop. So anyone who's coming to the workshop will get to experience, which is where we go, we travel forward to 2030 and we go forward to a future that has done everything it possibly could do. And we try and experience that. And what's that like? And I've done that with 10 people in the room, and I've done it with 1,500 people in a hall in Belgium. And actually, when you create the space for that and you hold it well, it's actually really pretty common what people come up with. Because what an exercise like that does is, like, if we start to talk about it now, what happens is we all of the dystopias come in the way and all of our difference comes in the way. But actually, if you use something like that where you step forward 10 years ahead, actually, I've done it so many times with so many very different audiences, and it's pretty much the same. People say, because it gets people out of short-term things that are about immediate pleasure and immediate happiness, which is what capitalism likes to retail to us, sell to us, and kind of co-opt. And it puts us into actually what gives us contentment, what gives us happiness. And people imagine futures in which, they've got more time and they're in a stronger community and they can hear the bird song. And I've never had anybody say, wow, it's great, there's this massive new IKEA just opened on the edge of my town, or I've got this amazing 8G phone. Actually, people, when you create the right conditions for those conversations, actually so much of it is really in common. And actually, as well, I would just encourage everybody to tell their stories. They're all going to be different, but actually, once we start, rather than just sort of sitting in our own organizations that have a very, very clear, specific kind of purpose, actually, if we create space for people to come together and dream and vision in that way, I think actually the common ground of the story comes through really clearly. And the book, the first 6 pages of the book, From What Is to What If, is my attempt at just describing a day in the life in that world. And it's been lovely during lockdown, the number of reports I've had of people writing and saying, we opened our conference with this, we opened our event with this. And I think we all need to become better at telling the stories. And I love how the Swedish government recently created a position of chief storyteller within that administration, whose role is to bring to life the day-to-day realities of living in a post-carbon world. And I feel like we all need to be able to become a chief storyteller. We all need to cultivate those skills.
Thank you. Someone was in a similar vein thinking about power structures or ownership. While education is important, when it comes down to it, how do we bring about these projects concretely when the ownership structures are perhaps not helping us? They might be standing in our way. How do we overcome that? How do we?
Well, I feel that's a great question, and I'm sure there are many, many people on this call who can answer that question far, far better than I can. My sense, the piece that I wanted to bring with this conversation to that question is that we need to be able to create the longing first. We need to have we need to shifting that kind of cultural story, and rather than always just imagining that we can win people over by scaring the bejesus out of them in terms of horrific visions of the future, let's become so much better at every conversation we have about climate, also including elements which are about how profound, extraordinary what we could create could be, and how do we bring that to life. I feel like that's why this revolution that we need in terms of food and farming needs to include artists and writers and filmmakers and poets. We need TV series and soap operas that just have that kind of future just as their background in a way that we don't even notice it, that it's just, we start to shift that sense of what's normal. And yet, of course, I'm not for a moment saying that this is easy. I've been working in this space for like 15, 20 years, and I know the challenges and how difficult it is to get hold of land and so on and so on. But I just feel like if we are, we recognize that if a population doesn't have a good enough diet, we're going to see a rise of preventable illnesses. We recognize if we don't have a good education system, then a population can't meet its full potential. But just slightly out of our eye shot, kind of over here, our collective imagination is kind of shrinking and shrinking. And unless we put that back in the table and say, no, this is really important, and unless people can imagine it, as I said at the beginning, you can't build what you can't imagine. We have to reimagine and rebuild everything, and that capacity needs to be built, and we need to build it in our movements, in our organizations, in our projects, in the way that we storytell about those projects. And if we can create that longing, then I think maybe a lot of the obstacles that are currently there start to become less of an issue.
I mean, one question was about how do we get food into the cities? How do we get local food into the cities? And imagining beyond the weekly farmers market. I mean, I lived in Brussels and there was a farmers market on every square every day of the week. You know, I mean, that was just the traditional way. But I guess it's, you know, rethinking how do we bring the food in from the
like I said, you know, that there are, so Julie Brown is going to be speaking on the 13th at 6 o'clock from Grown Communities. That's what they do, you know, and for me, when I went to Liège and I saw the Centre Alimentaire project in Liège, that's absolutely what they're doing. You know, they are using food to reimagine how universities, the hospitals, the schools supply themselves. They're changing their procurement policies to make that possible. You know, you could see a city reimagining its relationship with the land around it. And the thing that I loved about the petit producteur shops that I showed the pictures of was standing in that shop. You know, we get used, I think, often to those projects, to organic farm-based local food shops, tending to be a particular demographic who kind of frequent those shops. And actually, in Liège, it was people from all over the world and people of all different demographics and incomes, and it was just fantastic. And that's what for me, I found it really emotional. I've spent 15 years through the transition movement trying to promote this idea of more local, more resilient economies and how different that would be, and and they're standing in it, and I could see it, and it was employing people, and I could smell it and taste it and speak to the people and read the stories of where the food came from, and I found it really, really emotional.
Thank you. There's loads more questions, but this one strikes me as a nice one. Can you recommend fiction books that provoke our imagination?
At the moment, I'm reading The Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson, I think, which is a kind of a novel about how the climate emergency worked out. Okay, which I'm reading at the moment, which is quite fascinating. Yeah, that's a good one, I would say. I'm sure there would be other ones. I've only got some of my books here. Yeah, you know, people always say, can you think of where are the films that are like this? You know, where are the films that tell the story of transition working out okay? And you know, with so many dystopian films, and I always struggle to think of a film about how it turned out okay. The only one I ever think of is Wallace and Gromit and the Curse, where everybody's living in very energy efficient terraced houses and growing food everywhere and very proud of the food that they grow, and there are hardly any cars and people ride bicycles. So when I think of a film that is my vision of what a post-carbon world would look like, I tend to reach for Wallace and Gromit.
Yeah, Hollywood has a lot to answer for. There could be a lot happening through the world of film as well to rekindle our imagination. And someone else also talked about the importance of theatrical storytelling, using that as a way to rebuild our world. And I think we're sort of running out of time now, so I just want to say a big thank you to Rob for inspiring us all, and please do go along to his workshop if you feel like it, or enjoy the rest of the conference otherwise. But I'll just leave it up to you for your last word, Rob.
Well, no, just to say thank you very much to everybody for coming, and if you stay here, do enjoy Josina and Dee. They're both wonderful revolutionaries in this space, of whom I'm enormously in awe, and enjoy the rest of the conference, and it's been a delight to be here. Thank you.